In 1533, in the court of the French king, a servant lifted the goblet before his master could and drank first. If the wine was poisoned, he would be the one to fall. He kept the keys to the cellar, decided who drank what, and knew every bottle in the house. Nobody feared him for his palate. They feared him for his access. This is the origin of the sommelier, the servant who held the keys to the king's cellar and everyone's fate. So how did that terrified servant, tasting the king's wine to keep him alive, become the polished figure who now stands at your table selling you a bottle? The sommelier is a far stranger story than that composed face suggests. Picture them for a moment. The person who stands beside you in a fine restaurant, turns the bottle so the label faces you, and pours a small taste into your glass with the seriousness of a surgeon. We treat them as the very height of refinement, a trained expert whose palate you are supposed to trust and, quietly, to pay for. But the job did not begin with taste at all. It began with power, with keys, with poison, and with a word that has nothing to do with wine. To understand why half the world now calls the sommelier a scam, you have to follow the roll from a muddy medieval road all the way to a modern dining room and watch the exact moment it changed from a servant who protected you into an expert who bills you. Start with the word, because the word gives the whole thing away. Sommelier does not come from any Latin root for wine, or grape, or taste. It comes from the Old French word sommelier, which meant a driver of pack animals, the man who loaded and led the beasts of burden. Underneath it sits the word somme, a load, a burden, the weight strapped to the back of a mule. The most refined figure in the modern restaurant is named, at the very root, after the person who trudged along beside the luggage. Read that again, because it tells you exactly what this job was in the beginning. It was not about the nose, it was about the cargo. And notice a cousin of the word hiding in plain sight in English. The officer who guarded the bottles in a great house was the boutelier, and that word becomes our word butler. The one who ran the pantry became the pantler. These were not glamorous artists with delicate senses. They were trusted staff, ranked by exactly what they were allowed to hold the keys to, and the keys to the wine were among the most jealously guarded of all. In a household, control of the cellar was a form of genuine power, because wine was expensive. Wine was the gift you offered an honored guest, and wine was the easiest place in the house to hide a murder. In the great households of medieval France, the sommelier was the officer in charge of transport and provisions. When a lord and his court moved from one castle to another, and they moved constantly, someone had to organize the mules, the wagons, the baggage, the food, the linen, and above all, the wine. That someone was the sommelier. Over the years, the role settled indoors and narrowed. The man who once managed the whole moving cargo became the man who managed the single most precious and most dangerous part of it, the cellar. He held the keys, he controlled the bottles, and in a world where poison was a real tool of court politics, controlling the wine meant controlling life and death. This is where our opening servant comes from. At royal and noble tables, before the master drank, someone drank first. The practice had a name, the assay, or the credence, and it was deadly serious. The sommelier, or an officer beside him, would pour and sip to prove the wine was safe. Think about what that actually means. The most trusted person at the table was not trusted for his opinion of the vintage. He was trusted with his own body, as a living shield. His palate mattered only in the sense that he had to notice something was wrong before it killed the king. The reverence we now attach to the job was born as a bodyguard detail with a cup. And that fear was not paranoia. In the very year our servant lifts his goblet, 1533, a young Italian noblewoman named Catherine de' Medici arrived in France to marry into the royal family, and she carried with her the reputation of a court where poison was practically an art form. Whether or not the darkest stories about her are true, and many of them are almost certainly legend, the mere rumor tells you the climate these men worked in. The person who controlled the wine controlled the single most likely delivery system for a quiet death. So the keys on the sommelier's belt were not a decoration. They were the reason a king could sleep. To guard the cellar was to guard the crown. For centuries, the sommelier stayed inside the private household, a servant of the aristocracy, invisible to ordinary people. Then came the event that created the modern version of the job, the French Revolution. When the great noble houses collapsed after 1789, the cooks, the stewards, and the cellar-masters who had served them were suddenly out of work. So they did something new. They opened their skills to the public. The restaurant, in the form we know it, spread across Paris in exactly this period. and with it came a public version of the household staff. The private cellar-master became the restaurant wine steward. For the first time, an ordinary paying customer could sit down and be served wine by a professional whose entire job was the bottle. The servant of the king became the servant of anyone with money. Here is the hinge of the whole story, the moment the profession quietly flips. For almost all of its history, the sommelier worked for the person doing the drinking. He protected the master, guarded the master's cellar, tasted for the master's safety. He stood on your side of the table. But the restaurant changes the loyalty. Now the sommelier is employed by the house, and the house sells wine at a markup. The person recommending the bottle and the business profiting from the bottle became, for the first time, the same establishment. The role that began as your protector became, in its very structure, a salesman. That is the shift everything else in this story flows from. Hold on to it, because it is the reason the word scam ever enters the picture. Now, none of that means the skill is fake, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A serious sommelier really does train for years. There is genuine knowledge in matching a wine to a dish, in understanding why a soil, a slope, and a single hot summer change what ends up in the glass, in steering a nervous diner away from an expensive mistake towards something they will actually love. In 1977, the profession formalized all of this in London with the founding of the Court of Master Sommeliers, and the top qualification it offers, the Master Sommelier Diploma, is one of the hardest exams in the world. For decades, only a few hundred people on the entire planet have ever passed it. The tasting portion is brutal. A candidate is handed glasses of unlabeled wine and must name the grape, the region, and the vintage, blind, from taste alone. When it works, it looks like pure magic. And here is the detail everyone forgets. Think about why the ritual survived long after the danger that created it disappeared. Nobody at your table tonight seriously fears poison, yet the ceremony remains, the presentation, the pour, the pause. It stayed because it does something useful for the house. It signals care. It signals expertise. It makes the customer feel attended to by someone who knows more than they do, and a customer who feels that way orders up, not down. The theater that once proved the wine was safe now works to prove the wine is worth it. Same gestures, brand new purpose. And that is exactly where the doubt creeps in, because the science of taste is humbling. In 2001, a researcher at the University of Bordeaux named Frédéric Brochet ran a now famous experiment. He gave trained wine students a white wine, then gave them the same white wine dyed red with a flavorless coloring. Describing the red one, the students reached for the language of red wine, dark fruit, crushed berries, spice. The wine was white. Their expert vocabulary followed the color, not the liquid in the glass. In a companion study, the same kind of tasters rated an ordinary wine far more highly when it was poured from a bottle labeled a Grand Cru than when the identical wine came from a cheap label. The label moved the verdict more than the wine ever did. It gets worse for the mystique. In 2008, a team of researchers scanned people's brains while they sipped wine they were told cost either $90 a bottle or $10. It was the same wine. When the drinkers believed it was expensive, the pleasure centers of their brains actually lit up more. They were not lying, and they were not fools. The price tag physically changed how good the wine tasted to them. And in blind tests where the price is hidden, ordinary drinkers often cannot tell cheap from expensive at all, and now and then they gently prefer the cheaper glass. Then there is the most famous humbling of them all, the 1976 tasting in Paris, when a panel of top French judges, tasting blind, ranked upstart California wines above their own celebrated bottles, and at first flatly refused to believe their own results. You can even watch the psychology play out on a wine list tonight. Restaurateurs have long known a quiet truth about human behavior, that diners are faintly embarrassed to order the cheapest bottle on the page, so they reach instead for the second cheapest, to look a little generous without overspending. And that second cheapest slot is very often exactly where the house hides its fattest margin. The list itself is engineered around how you feel, not around what tastes best. The sommelier's warm suggestion simply completes a machine that was built, line by line, to move you gently up the price ladder. So what does this job look like today, and where does the money actually sit? Here are the numbers. The global wine market is worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Inside a restaurant, wine is one of the most profitable things on the entire menu, and it is completely normal for a bottle to be sold at 2 to 3 times its wholesale price, sometimes more. A wine that a shop sells for $30 can appear on a restaurant list for $90 without anyone blinking. At the top of the profession, the reward is real and it is large. An advanced sommelier or a wine director at a serious restaurant can earn well into six figures, often somewhere between $80,000 and $250,000 a year in a major city, and the rarest, master sommeliers command consulting fees on top of that. Here is one worked example to make it concrete. When you accept the sommelier's suggestion and let them open that $90 bottle, roughly 60 of those dollars is markup that stays with the house, and the person who guided you toward it is paid, in part, to do precisely that. And the aura of infallibility has cracked from the inside too. In 2018, the Court of Master Sommeliers itself was rocked by a cheating scandal when it emerged that answers to the famously hard-tasting exam had leaked in advance, and the organization was forced to strip a whole class of newly crowned masters of their titles. The magic, it turned out, was guarded by people, and people are fallible. So walk all the way back to where we started, to the servant in 1533, lifting the goblet before the king, keys on his belt, ready to die if the wine was wrong. He was not selling you anything. His entire value was that he stood between you and the danger in the cup. The modern sommelier inherited his rituals, the pour, the presentation, the solemn nod, but not his loyalty. Today, the person performing that ceremony works for the house, and the house lives on the markup. The tasting was never really the point. The trust is the product. That elaborate ritual at your table, the swirl, the sniff, the reverent silence, is not there only to help you drink better. It is there to make the price feel earned. That's not an accident. That's the business model. None of this means good wine is a lie, or that real skill does not exist, because it plainly does. It means you should simply know what you are paying for. Trust your own mouth. Ask the price before you nod. And remember that the most intimidating person in the room is descended, by the very name he carries, from a man who walked all day beside the mules. If this video changed how you look at the bottle on your table, subscribe, because next we're covering more everyday jobs whose real history nobody tells you.